The world wasn't just spinning, it was shattering. One moment, the rhythmic creak of wood and leather was the only sound. The next, a crack like a thunderclap ripped through the canyon. The stagecoach pitched forward, a violent, gut-wrenching lurch that threw 5 women from their seats like rag dolls. Splintering wood screamed, glass exploded, and the terrified cries of horses echoed off the stone walls. The whole world went sideways, dust and chaos, the smell of panicked animals and dry, cracked earth. When the motion finally stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. It was heavy, broken only by groans and the useless, rhythmic spinning of a single wheel against the merciless blue sky. Inside the wreckage, 5 women, 5 strangers, were tangled in a heap of broken dreams and petticoats. They'd been traveling for days, each one clutching a contract that promised them a new life, a marriage to a man they'd never met in a town they'd never seen, a town called Prosperity. But as the dust began to settle, one of them, the eldest, Eleanor Bennett, dragged herself through a shattered window. She stood on the side of the overturned coach and surveyed the ruin. The driver lay twisted and still beside the spooked horses. And all around them, for miles in every direction, was nothing but the jagged, unforgiving walls of Serpent Canyon. They were alone. They were lost. And their journey to prosperity was already over. Or so they thought. Because as Eleanor scanned the horizon, her heart sinking with every beat, a figure appeared on the ridge above. A silhouette against the sun. A man watching them. He wasn't a threat. He was their only hope. And he carried secrets about prosperity that were darker and more dangerous than the deepest shadows in that canyon. Secrets that were about to change everything. Let's go back just a few weeks. April 1876, Philadelphia. Eleanor Bennett was a woman out of options. At 28, she was a teacher without a school, a daughter without a family. Her father's death had left her with nothing but debts, and the radical idea that women should be educated had cost her her job. She was a spinster, a word that tasted like ash in her mouth. Then she saw the advertisement. Brides wanted for the booming frontier town of Prosperity. Passage paid, a new life guaranteed. The recruitment agent, a man named Walters with a face like a tired bulldog, had laid it out plain. Prosperity needs wives for its miners and merchants, he'd said, sliding the contract across his desk. The journey is long, but the reward is security. Security. For a woman with nothing, the word was a lifeline. She signed her name, binding herself to a Thomas Miller, a shopkeeper in a town that barely existed on any map. She traded her independence for a promise. At the stagecoach station, she met the others. 4 women, each one a mirror of her own quiet desperation. There was Mary Thompson, the youngest, barely 17. A girl with blonde curls and a face still soft with youth, twisting a handkerchief until her knuckles were white. She was promised to a miner, a man named William Parker. She whispered his name like a prayer she was trying to believe in. Then came Sarah Reynolds, tall, severe, with dark hair pinned so tight it seemed to pull at her scalp. Her green eyes held a defiant fire. "Let's not pretend this is a pleasure trip," she'd said, her voice sharp. "We've all sold ourselves one way or another." She was a music teacher, now bound for a frontier church and the bed of a deacon named Robert Fletcher. Rebecca Collins was next, a soft-spoken woman in a fine blue dress that had seen better days. A southern accent clung to her words. She was a war widow, a trained nurse who planned to marry the town doctor, Benjamin Harris, and perhaps practice medicine herself. She called it a business arrangement, a choice she'd made for herself. And finally, Josephine Martinez. She stood apart, her dark hair and olive skin a stark contrast to the others. She carried herself with a pride that dared anyone to question her. "My father was Spanish, my mother from Boston," she announced, her chin held high. "And yes, my contract is with the saloon owner, James Wilson." She was ready for judgment, but Eleonora offered none. They were strangers, 5 women from 5 different worlds, crammed into the belly of a Concorde coach, bound together by a shared unspoken fear. 14 days to prosperity, ladies," the driver had called out as the coach lurched forward. "God willing and the creek don't rise." For days they traveled in a haze of discomfort and dust. The world outside the small windows changed from crowded city streets to rolling farms, then to endless empty plains. An uneasy truce formed within the coach. They shared stale bread and sips of water. They shared stories. Rebecca spoke of her first husband, a man nearly 3 times her age, arranged by her mother. This time, she said, her voice quiet but firm, at least I made the choice myself. Sarah scoffed. Choice? What choice does a woman have when society leaves her no respectable way to survive? Even Josephine, the pragmatic one, shared a flask of silver-laced courage, her laugh a surprising, musical sound in the tense silence. They were starting to become a unit, a strange and fragile sisterhood forged in the crucible of a 14-day journey. Then they reached the foothills of the mountains. We'll be taking Serpent Canyon, the driver announced one morning. It's the fastest route. Cuts 2 days off the journey. Charlie, the driver's young assistant, who'd barely spoken a word the whole trip, finally piped up. Walls rise up 100 feet in places, he said, his eyes lingering on Mary. Narrows down so tight you can touch both sides. His voice was low, laced with something that might have been awe, or maybe fear. As they entered the canyon, it was like entering another world. The sun vanished, blocked by towering rock walls that cast them in a perpetual, chilly shadow. The road became a narrow, crumbling ledge, with a sheer drop to a shallow, rushing stream below. Josephine pointed to strange markings high on the rock face. Old signs, Charlie confirmed. Some folks say this canyon's haunted, and that's when it happened. One of the lead horses screamed, a sound of pure terror, spooked by something none of them could see. The driver cursed, fighting the reins, the coach lurching dangerously close to the edge. Steady, he shouted. Steady! Then came the sound, the sickening crack of the front axle giving way. The world tilted, a horrifying, weightless sensation of falling. Glass shattered. A scream was swallowed by the chaos. And then, nothing but the spinning wheel and the crushing silence. Eleanor's first thought was to check for survivors. One by one, they answered her call, their voices shaky in the overturned coach. Mary had a nasty cut above her eye. Josephine was pressing a handkerchief to a gash on her forehead. Sarah, somehow, was mostly unharmed, but Rebecca's arm was bent at an angle that made Eleanor's stomach turn. They scrambled out, helping each other through the broken window frame. The scene outside was dire. The driver was dead. Charlie, the young assistant, was simply gone, vanished. Eleanor climbed to a higher vantage point, her mind racing. Which way was prosperity? Which way was back? The canyon wall stretched out in a dizzying, identical maze. They were well and truly lost. And that's when she saw him, the figure on the ridge, watching. Hello, she called, waving her arms, her voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. We need help. For a heart-stopping moment, the figure disappeared, abandoned. The thought was a cold knot in her gut. But then he reappeared, much lower, making his way down a path so narrow it was nearly invisible. He moved with a confidence that spoke of years spent in this wild place. As he got closer, she could make out the details. Worn buckskin clothes, a rifle slung over his back, a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes so blue they seemed to burn against his tan skin. He took in the whole scene in a single, sweeping glance. The dead driver, the wrecked coach, the 5 disheveled women. Seems you've had some trouble, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He tipped a non-existent hat. Name's Jackson, Jackson Reed. Eleanor stepped forward, the designated leader. We are grateful for your assistance, Mr. Reed. Our driver is dead, and we are lost. We were bound for prosperity. At the mention of the town, something flickered in his eyes. A shadow, a memory. Prosperity, he repeated, and the word hung in the air between them, heavy and strange. That's a 3-day walk from here, assuming you know the way. He looked at their torn dresses and city shoes. And you folks surely don't. Josephine came to stand beside Eleonora, her usual bravado slightly dented. You know the way. Jackson Reed's gaze passed over each of them, his expression unreadable. I know every inch of this canyon. Been living out here for 7 years. He paused, a long, calculating silence. I can get you there. But not before dark. We'll need to make camp. As he moved to calm the terrified horses, Sarah leaned in close to Eleonora. Can we trust him? She whispered, her voice laced with suspicion. Eleonora watched as Jackson spoke to the animals in a low, soothing tone, his hands gentle but sure. What choice do we have? She whispered back. What none of them knew was that this solitary man wasn't just a guide. He was a guardian, a ghost haunting the edges of a town built on lies. He knew the path to prosperity, but he also knew its secrets. And as the sun began to dip below the canyon rim, casting long, menacing shadows, Jackson Reed made a silent vow. History was not going to repeat itself, not on his watch. As darkness fell, the canyon grew teeth, the temperature dropped, and the wind began to whisper through the rocks. Jackson worked with a quiet efficiency that was both reassuring and unsettling. He salvaged what he could from the coach, a sack of cornmeal, some jerky, a few blankets. With practiced hands, he fashioned a makeshift splint for Rebecca's arm from splintered wood and strips of leather. The bone's not broken clean through, he said, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. But it needs a proper setting. Rebecca, pale but stoic, simply nodded. Mary, her voice trembling, suggested they bury the driver. Jackson shook his head. Ground's too hard. We'll cover him with stones. It's the best we can do. Sarah, ever the skeptic, crossed her arms. And how is it you just happened to be here, Mr. Reed? Right when we needed you. Jackson finished securing Rebecca's splint before he answered, his blue eyes meeting hers without a flinch. I was tracking a mountain lion, heard the crash. Folks don't usually survive accidents in Serpent Canyon. You're lucky. Lucky? Josephine let out a bitter laugh. 5 women stranded in the wilderness with a dead man and a stranger. Doesn't feel very lucky to me. You're alive, Jackson said, and the way he said it made the hairs on Eleanor's arms stand up. It wasn't a platitude, it was a statement of fact, weighted with unspoken history. He led them to a sheltered alcove about a quarter-mile away, where a small freshwater spring trickled from the rock. As they walked, Eleonora found herself beside him. You said you live out here alone, she said quietly, probing. Prosperity is the nearest town. Why not live there? He was silent for a long time, his eyes scanning the darkening canyon walls. Prosperity isn't what its name suggests, he finally said, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. What do you mean? He stopped and turned to face her, his expression grim in the fading light. The silver mine that built the town, it's playing out. The men are getting desperate. They advertise for brides to give them a reason to stay, to keep digging in a worthless hole. He let that sink in before he delivered the next blow. 3 years back, they brought in 12 brides, a group just like yours. Eleonora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What happened to them? Jackson's jaw tightened. Within a year, 5 of them were dead. How? The word was a choked whisper. Mining accidents claimed 3 of their husbands, leaving them widows. One, they say, couldn't handle the isolation and walked out into a blizzard. Another, he hesitated and the silence stretched, heavy with dread. Another died under suspicious circumstances. Her husband claimed she fell. There were rumors. Eleonora's mind was reeling, connecting the dots. His solitude, his knowledge of the canyon, the flicker in his eyes when she'd mentioned the town. And you know all this because... The words, when they came, were flat and hard, like stones dropping into a deep well. My sister was one of them, Emma Reed. She married the town assayer, a man named Harrison Wells. 6 months later, she was dead. They said she fell down a mine shaft. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. You don't believe it was an accident, Eleonora stated, knowing the answer. I know it wasn't, he said, his voice a low growl of fury and grief. But one man's word against a whole town? They close ranks. They protect their own. So you left, Eleanor said, understanding dawning. You became a hermit. I didn't leave to hide, he corrected her, his eyes glinting with a fierce light. I left to watch. From up here, I see everything that comes in and out of prosperity, including stagecoaches full of brides. He gave a grim nod. This is the 3rd group I've seen. I was planning to intercept your coach before it reached the canyon, warn you away. Why didn't you? Because your coach wasn't just late, he said, and a new terrible thought began to form in Eleanor's mind. It was early, and it was moving too fast for this part of the canyon, almost as if the driver lost control, Eleanor finished, or as if someone made him lose control. The disappearance of Charlie, the young assistant, suddenly seemed far more sinister. Before she could ask more, a sound cut through the night. A distant rhythmic thudding. Hoofbeats. Jackson's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The grieving brother vanished, replaced by a hardened survivalist. "Everyone up, now!" he commanded, his voice sharp. "We need to move." "What is it?" Josephine demanded as they scrambled to their feet. "Riders," Jackson said, his eyes scanning the canyon rim. "At least 3 of them, moving fast." "From Prosperity?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. "No," he said, his face a grim mask. "Wrong direction. Apache. There's a small band that hunts these canyons. They've had trouble with settlers lately. They won't welcome strangers." The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, then abruptly stopped. "They're on foot now," Jackson whispered, ushering them under a dark, overhanging ledge. "They're tracking us. Stay here. Don't make a sound." Before anyone could protest, he was gone, melting into the shadows like a ghost. The 5 women huddled together, the vast hostile darkness of the canyon pressing in on them, caught between a town of secrets and a band of unseen hunters. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the wind and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, sent a fresh jolt of fear through them. "I never should have come," Mary whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "My stepfather, he was so eager to be rid of me." Sarah, surprisingly, put a comforting arm around the younger girl. "We all had our reasons, child." They shared their stories in hushed, desperate whispers there in the dark. Sarah's father gambling away their home, Rebecca's in-laws blaming her for not producing an heir, Josephine's family shunning her for her mixed heritage. They were all running from something. They had all chosen prosperity as the lesser of 2 evils. A low whistle cut through the darkness, and Jackson materialized beside them as silently as he had disappeared. "They've split up," he whispered, his breath coming in quick pants. "Searching the side canyons. We have maybe 30 minutes before they find our trail. My cabin is still a mile from here." "Can we make it?" Sarah asked. "Not all together. Not with Rebecca," he said, his eyes finding Eleanor's in the gloom. "I have to create a diversion. Draw them away from you." He pressed a small folded piece of leather into her hand. "It's a map to the cabin. Follow the dry creek bed to 3 standing stones, then head east. It's hidden in a box canyon. Bar the door as soon as you get inside." "You expect us to find our way in the dark?" Sarah protested. "There's a half moon rising. It'll be enough," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked at Eleonora, his gaze intense. "Keep them moving. No matter what you hear, don't stop." He then pulled a heavy pistol from his boot and pushed it into her hand. "6 shots. Use them only if you have to." "I've never fired a gun," she admitted, the weight of it terrifying. "Point and squeeze," he said simply. He looked at each of them, his expression a mixture of grim determination and something else. Responsibility. "Stay together. Trust each other. I'll find you by morning, if I can." And then he was gone again. Minutes later, a shout echoed from the opposite direction, followed by the sound of falling rocks, a deliberate, calculated noise designed to draw attention. "He's drawing them away," Eleonora said, her voice tight. "We have to move. Now." They stumbled through the darkness, with Eleanor in the lead, clutching the map and the pistol. Sarah and Josephine supported Rebecca between them, while Mary carried their meager supplies. The rising moon cast long, ghostly shadows that played tricks on their eyes. Progress was agonizingly slow. Every step was a struggle. In the distance, they heard another shout, and then the sharp crack of a rifle shot that seemed to shake the very walls of the canyon. "We should have stayed with him," Mary sobbed. "He knew what he was doing," Eleanor said, though the same fear was gnawing at her own stomach. "We have to trust him." They finally found the dry creek bed, the moonlight glinting off smooth, pale stones. They followed it for what felt like miles until, at last, Eleonora saw them. Three tall, slender stones standing like sentinels against the canyon wall. "This way," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. The path led steeply upward. It was a grueling, desperate climb, half carrying, half dragging Rebecca up the loose shale. When they finally reached the top, a small hidden box canyon opened before them. And there, nestled against the far wall, was a crude but sturdy-looking cabin. They stumbled inside, barring the heavy wooden door behind them. The cabin was a single room, sparse but meticulously organized. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, shelves stocked with jars and tins. It was the home of a man who lived on the edge of the world, prepared for anything. As the others tended to Rebecca and tried to start a fire, Eleanor's eyes fell on a small desk in the corner. On it sat a leather-bound journal, much like her own. Her curiosity warred with her conscience. It was an invasion of privacy, but this man held their lives in his hands. They needed to know who he truly was. Making sure the others were occupied, she crossed the room and opened the journal. The handwriting was not the rough scrawl of a mountain man, but the careful, educated script of a scholar. The last entry was dated just 3 days earlier, April 17th. Scout reports another stagecoach of brides is expected. 5 this time. It fits the pattern. 3 years of watching has confirmed it. The deaths are not accidents. Prosperity is a lie. And the men are not husbands. They are keepers. The mine is a ghost. The investors are being bled dry. The brides are just props in the theater, meant to keep the miners hoping, keep them digging. But when the props learn the truth, they become liabilities. I have mapped the graves, 12 in 3 years. Only 4 have markers. Emma's is one. The others are hidden like trash in the canyon walls. This has to end. I have names, dates, suspicions, but no proof a judge would accept. The sheriff, the doctor, the deacon, they are all complicit. Letters to the governor go unanswered. There is only one solution left, one I have avoided for too long. Prosperity must be burned to the ground, metaphorically or otherwise, and I am the only one who can light the match. Eleanora closed the journal, her blood running cold. Jackson Reed wasn't just a grieving brother. He was a man on a mission, a self-appointed judge, jury, and potentially executioner. And their stagecoach crash hadn't just put them in his path. It had made them the fuse. Just then, a sharp, urgent rap on the door made every woman in the cabin jump. "It's Reed," came a low voice from outside. "I'm alone. Let me in." Sarah moved to the door, clutching the pistol Eleanor had set on the table. "How do we know it's you?" she challenged, her voice tight with suspicion. The driver's name was Mitchell. The voice came back, laced with impatience. His assistant, Charlie, had eyes for the blonde girl. "I gave Miss Bennett a pistol with 6 shots, which I see you've taken from her. Now open the damn door before those trackers double back." Sarah unbarred the door, and Jackson stumbled in, his buckskin shirt torn at the shoulder, a bloody gash beneath it. He quickly secured the door behind him. His eyes swept the room, taking everything in, and then they landed on Eleonora, standing by the desk with the open journal. He knew. "We need to talk, Mr. Reed," Eleonora said, her voice steady, meeting his gaze without flinching. "About your sister, about the 12 graves, and about what, exactly, you plan to do with us." A tense silence filled the small cabin. Jackson didn't deny it. He walked over to the fireplace, stoked the embers, and added a fresh log. The flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows across his grim face. "You might as well know it all," he said, finally turning to face them. And so he told them everything. He spoke of a booming silver town, full of hope and promise. He spoke of his sister Emma, a smart, vibrant woman who worked in the assay office. He spoke of her marriage to Harrison Wells, a man who seemed perfect on the surface. Then he spoke of the silver running out. The town council, the mine owner, the banker, the most powerful men. They couldn't let the town die, he explained, his voice low and bitter. Their fortunes were tied to it, so they cooked up a plan. They started falsifying the production reports to keep the investor money flowing from the east. And to keep the miners from leaving, they needed to give them a reason to stay. They needed to sell them a future. Wives, Rebecca whispered from the bed, her face a pale mask in the firelight. Jackson nodded. The first group of brides arrived, and for a while it worked. But some of the women were smart. My sister Emma was the smartest. Working in the assay office, she saw the real numbers. She knew the mine was a fraud. He crossed the room, pried up a loose floorboard, and pulled out a small metal box. From it, he took a creased, worn letter. This is the last thing she ever wrote to me. Eleonora took the letter. Emma's handwriting was frantic, the ink smudged. Dearest Jack, it read, what I suspected is true. The reports are falsified. Harrison knows I've seen the real figures. He struck me. I fear what he and the council will do. 3 women have died in accidents this year. All of them had started asking questions. I think I'm next. If anything happens, don't trust the official story. Look to the abandoned Henderson shaft. The letter ended there, unfinished. 2 days later, she was dead, Jackson said, his voice raw. They buried her within hours. Said the body was too damaged to be viewed. And the Henderson shaft? Josephine asked. It's where they put the bodies, Jackson said grimly. The women who learned the truth. The men who wouldn't play along. Even a territorial inspector who showed up unannounced. I found at least 8 unmarked graves there. This is murder, Eleanor breathed. And I can't prove it, Jackson said, the frustration of years evident in his voice. The sheriff, the doctor, they're all on the council's payroll. I'm just a crazy hermit in the mountains, a grieving brother with conspiracy theories. He looked at them, his blue eyes burning with a desperate intensity. Your stagecoach crashing was an opportunity. I was going to use your testimony as survivors who I'd warned to finally force an investigation. A plan that has gone horribly wrong, Sarah said flatly. Yes, Jackson admitted, because now I have 5 witnesses who are trapped, one of whom needs a doctor who isn't a laudanum-addicted killer. A new urgency filled the room. The assistant, Charlie, had survived the crash. He would have made it to prosperity by now. They would already know about the accident. A search party could be on its way. So what do we do? Mary asked, her voice small. Eleanor looked at the letter in her hand, at the maps of the unmarked graves, at the determined, broken man in front of her. A wild, impossibly dangerous idea began to form in her mind. We don't run, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction that surprised even herself. They're expecting 5 frightened, helpless brides to stumble into town. So that's what we'll give them. Jackson stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Absolutely not. I won't let you walk into that viper's nest. You won't be letting us, Eleonora countered, her eyes flashing. We'll be going. You've spent years watching from the outside, Mr. Reed. We can go to the inside. We can get the proof you need. We can find the real account books, the doctor's records, the evidence that will burn prosperity to the ground. The other women stared at her, a mixture of terror and awe on their faces. It was a suicide mission, a plan so audacious, so insane, that it just might work. Josephine was the first to speak, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. I've always wanted to see the inside of a corrupt saloon owner's office. The plan they hatched was born of desperation and firelight. It was a tapestry of lies, woven together with threads of incredible risk. They would walk into prosperity, playing the part of grateful survivors. Each woman would go to her intended, embedding herself in the very heart of the conspiracy. Sarah, bound for the deacon, would have access to the church, their designated dead drop location, a place to leave messages and hidden evidence. Rebecca, as the doctor's wife-to-be, would be perfectly positioned to search for medical records, looking for patterns in the so-called accidental deaths. Mary, intended for the young miner, would be their ears at the mine itself, listening to the whispers and complaints of the men who were being lied to every day. Josephine would take on the saloon owner, the most dangerous role, placing herself at the center of the town's dark dealings. And Eleonora, as the future wife of the general store owner, would have access to the town's lifeblood, its supplies, its credit, its account books. Jackson, though he hated the plan, knew it was their only real chance. He agreed to remain in the canyons, a ghost in the mountains watching over them. He devised a system of signals, a hymnal left open in the church. Page 12. All is well. Page 24. A discovery has been made. Page 36. Danger. Extraction needed immediately. He gave each of them a small, carved wooden token, an eagle design he used for trading with a friendly band of Apache. If you're separated and in real trouble, show this to any native you see. Ask for Hawkeye. It's what they call me. It's a last resort, but they might help you. Their escape route, should they need it, would be the very place the council hid its secrets, the abandoned Henderson mine shaft. It connected to the main tunnels, and Jackson knew a ventilation shaft that opened up in the cemetery behind the church. 3 days, Eleonora said, setting the deadline. We gather what we can in 3 days. Then, evidence or not, we meet at the church at midnight on the 3rd day and we get out. As the first light of dawn broke over the canyon, they prepared to leave the safety of the cabin. Jackson gave them each a small knife, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and what little food he could spare. He led them down a different path, back into the main canyon, coaching them on their story. They had survived the crash, been disoriented, and wandered for a day before finding the trail to town. He smudged dirt on their faces and tore their dresses, just a little more to make the story believable. At the final ridge overlooking the path to prosperity, he stopped. Trust no one, he warned, his eyes locking onto Eleanor's. But look for allies. My sister's diary mentioned a few people she thought were suspicious of the council. The seamstress, Mabel Winters, the telegraph operator's wife, an old prospector named Samuel Tucker. He looked at each of them, the 5 women who had become his unwilling soldiers. Be smart, be safe, and don't be heroes. The evidence is no good if you're dead. With a final, solemn nod, he vanished back into the rocks, leaving them alone. They walked for hours, the weight of their mission settling upon them. They were no longer just brides seeking security. They were spies, investigators, walking into a town of murderers with nothing but their wits and each other. When prosperity finally came into view, it looked deceptively peaceful. A cluster of wooden buildings, smoke curling from chimneys. But they knew what lay beneath the surface. Their arrival caused a stir, just as they'd planned. A blacksmith spotted them first, and soon the whole town was pouring into the street. The sheriff, a man with a tarnished silver star and cold, calculating eyes, was the first to greet them. His name was Daniel Wilson, the saloon owner's brother. Eleonora told their story, her voice trembling with practiced fear and exhaustion. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his suspicion a palpable thing. He listened, then immediately dispatched a party of men to the crash site to confirm their story. The clock was already ticking. One by one, they met their intendeds. Thomas Miller, Eleanor's shopkeeper, reeked of whiskey. Deacon Fletcher, Sarah's match, had a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Dr. Harris, who came to tend to Rebecca, had hands that shook so badly he could barely tie a bandage. Mary's William Parker was just a boy, his eyes full of a nervous hope that was almost heartbreaking. Only Josephine's intended, James Wilson, was absent, handling business, according to his brother, the sheriff. Just when the interrogation seemed it would never end, a kindly-looking older woman bustled through the crowd. "For heaven's sake, Daniel, let these poor dears rest," she scolded the sheriff. It was Mabel Winters, the seamstress Jackson had mentioned. She herded them away to the boarding house she ran, clucking over them like a mother hen. Once they were alone in the parlor, Mabel's demeanor shifted. "You poor things," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Surviving such an ordeal. Reminds me of poor Emma Wells. Such a tragedy, her accident at the mine." She looked directly at Eleonora, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "This town has seen its share of sorrows. Best to keep your questions to a minimum, and your ears wide open." The message was clear. They had found their first ally. The next 2 days were a blur of tension and deception. Each woman played her part to perfection, gathering small, dangerous pieces of the puzzle. Sarah, at the church with Deacon Fletcher, discovered the town's official records. The dates of death for the previous brides were all neatly recorded, the causes listed as fever, accident, or childbirth. But next to each entry was a note about the deceased's property and mining claims being reabsorbed by the town council. It was a ledger of death and profit. She placed a hymnal on the lectern, open to page 24. Discovery made. Mary, delivering meals to the mine with the other wives, listened to the grumbling of the miners. They spoke of digging in veins they knew were worthless, of being paid in promises and store credit that was nearly maxed out. Her young intended, William, seemed different. He was quiet, and when he thought no one was looking, he'd stare at the head frame of the mine not with hope, but with a deep, weary sadness. He was a good man, trapped in a bad situation. Rebecca, feigning a slow recovery under Dr. Harris's laudanum-laced care, gained access to his office. While he was out on a call, she found his private medical files. The files for the dead brides were thin, their symptoms vague. But tucked away at the back, she found his order logs from an out-of-territory supplier. He was purchasing large quantities of tasteless, fast-acting poisons, citing a need to control the rodent population at the mine. Josephine, at the saloon, endured the leering advances of James Wilson. He was a cruel, arrogant man who saw her as nothing more than property. But in his cups, he was also a braggart. He boasted of the final big investment arriving from the East any day now. He mentioned a cleanup that would need to happen before the council relocated with their profits. She learned his private account books, the ones detailing the entire fraud, were kept in a safe behind a painting in his office. Eleonora, working in the general store, saw the town's decay firsthand. The shelves were full, but the account books showed that nearly every citizen was deep in debt to her intended, Thomas Miller, who was in turn deeply in debt to the council's bank. The entire town was a house of cards built on lies and propped up by murder. She found her chance when Mabel Winters came into the store. Under the guise of helping her find a dropped thimble, Mabel led Eleanor to her small house. There, from a hiding spot beneath the floorboards, she produced a packet of papers. "Emma gave these to me the day before she died," Mabel whispered, her eyes filled with tears. They were the real assay reports, showing the mine's true, pathetic yields, placed right next to the forged reports sent to the investors. It was the smoking gun. "Be careful," Mabel warned, pressing the papers into Eleanor's hands. "Tonight is the official welcome celebration at the church hall. It's not a party, it's an evaluation. They'll be watching you, all of you, deciding if you're the kind of women who will accept their story, or the kind who, like Emma, will ask too many questions." The welcome celebration was a grotesque parody of a party. The hall was decorated, the music was lively, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. The town council sat on a raised platform like kings, their eyes sweeping over their new acquisitions. The women separated, moving through the crowd, gathering final pieces of intelligence. But the net was tightening. The sheriff pulled Eleonora aside, his questions about the crash site becoming more pointed. He mentioned that the search party had found tracks that didn't match their story, the tracks of a single man, Jackson Reed, leading away from the crash. The plan was beginning to unravel. The breaking point came when James Wilson, drunk and impatient, grabbed Josephine's arm, demanding she accompany him back to the saloon to begin her duties. This was the moment they had dreaded. Josephine, with a steady hand, enacted their desperate plan. She'd managed to dose his last glass of whiskey with a powerful emetic Jackson had given them. She excused herself, promising to follow him in a few minutes. Instead, she slipped out a side door to meet Eleonora at their prearranged spot in the cemetery behind the church. "I have maybe half an hour before he's indisposed," Josephine said breathlessly. "It's my only chance to get to that safe." "It's too dangerous," Eleonora argued. "They're suspicious." But before she could say more, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Jackson. "The search party found more than tracks," he said, his voice grim. "They found the remains of my campfire near where I left you. They know you had help. They know you lied." He had slipped into town through the mine's ventilation shaft, risking everything to warn them. Their whispered, frantic conversation was cut short by a cold, familiar voice. "I thought I might find a ghost tonight," Sheriff Wilson said, stepping from behind a tombstone, his revolver aimed squarely at Jackson's chest. "Fancy seeing you back in prosperity, Reed." The cemetery was dead silent. The faint music from the church hall seemed a world away. Sheriff Wilson's gun was steady, his smile chilling. "Step away from the man, ladies," he ordered. His grief over his sister has addled his mind. Eleanor and Josephine didn't move. They stood their ground, flanking Jackson. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "I'm placing him under arrest. You two will return to the party, and we'll forget this little meeting ever happened." It was a standoff. A single wrong move would end it all. Then a voice called out from the church. A welcome interruption. It was Deacon Fletcher. The distraction was all Jackson needed. He moved like lightning, shoving the women aside and lunging at the sheriff. The gun went off, a deafening crack that split the night, the bullet flying harmlessly into the air. The two men crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs in fury. "Run!" Jackson yelled, grappling for the gun. Fletcher shouted the alarm. The town, already on edge, exploded into chaos. Eleanor grabbed Josephine's arm and pulled her into the darkness. They fled, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Their cover was blown. The investigation was over. Now it was just about survival. They raced back to the boarding house to find the others already packing. The gunshot had been the signal. "Jackson's been captured," Eleanor explained in frantic, clipped sentences. "We have to go. Now. To the church." But just as they were about to slip out the back, Mabel Winters appeared, a ring of keys in her hand. "The council is meeting at the saloon," she said breathlessly. "They're trying to decide what to do with you. The town is in chaos. It's your best chance to move." She pressed the keys into Eleanor's hand. Keys to the jail, the church, the saloon's back door. Emma had them made. She gave Josephine the combination to the safe she'd managed to glimpse one night. A new, even more reckless plan was formed in an instant. "Sarah, you take Mary and Rebecca to the church," Eleanor commanded. "Bar the vestry door and wait for us. Josephine and I are going to the saloon. We're getting those books." "We don't separate," Sarah protested. "We have to," Eleanor shot back. "We have Mabel's evidence, but the ledgers are the final nail in their coffin. Go." As Sarah's group disappeared into the night, Mabel created a diversion, setting a small, smoky fire in a trash bin behind the boarding house, drawing the disorganized search parties away. Eleanor and Josephine slipped through the back alleys, reaching the saloon just as the council members rushed out to see what the new commotion was. Using Mabel's key, they entered the storeroom, crept behind the bar, and opened the safe. They grabbed the ledgers, the detailed, damning proof of every crime, every murder, every dollar stolen. But as they tried to leave, James Wilson stumbled back in, drunk and furious. They flattened themselves behind a stack of barrels, their hearts in their throats, as he passed within inches of them, completely oblivious. They made it to the church just as the clock began to toll midnight. Sarah, Mary, and Rebecca were waiting, their faces etched with worry. They were all together, and they had the evidence. They pulled back a panel behind the altar, revealing the dark, musty opening to the Henderson mine shaft. Their escape route. But as they prepared to enter, the church doors burst open. Sheriff Wilson and his men stormed in. "They're here somewhere," he roared. "Find them." Thinking fast, Eleanor shoved the ledgers into Sarah's hands. "Take these. Get down the shaft. Go. Josephine and I will buy you time." As Sarah, Mary, and Rebecca disappeared into the passage, Eleanor created a diversion, knocking over a stack of hymnals and then running for a side door, drawing the bulk of the search party after her. She led them on a wild chase through the muddy streets, away from the church, away from the mine. She was fast, but they were faster. They caught her at the edge of town, dragging her back to the jail. They threw her in the cell next to Jackson. The council members soon arrived, their faces masks of fury. "The books are gone," Wilson snarled. "Where are they?" Eleanor and Jackson remained silent. "The Henderson shaft," Blackwood, the mine owner, realized. "They're in the mine. Seal both ends. Flood it if you have to." The casual order to commit mass murder chilled Eleanor to the bone. They were trapped. Their friends were walking into an ambush, or worse, a watery grave. All hope seemed lost. Deep beneath the earth, Sarah, Mary, and Rebecca felt the first trickle of water at their feet. It quickly became a stream, then a rushing torrent. "They're flooding it!" Sarah yelled over the roar. They scrambled forward, the water rising around their waists, the candlelight sputtering. They saw it just in time. A sliver of gray light. The exit. They clawed their way out of the collapsed opening and onto a steep canyon slope, just as dawn was breaking. But their relief was shattered by the sound of voices from below. A search party, led by one of Wilson's men, was already climbing toward them. They were trapped. Mary clutched the wooden token Jackson had given her. It was their last, desperate hope. Just as the first of the men spotted them, a figure rose from the rocks above, an Apache woman. She held a rifle, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they thought they were done for, but then her eyes fell on the token in Mary's hand. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. "Hawkeye," she said. Then she gestured for them to follow her, up a seemingly impassable cliff face, where horses were waiting. They had been saved. Back in Prosperity, the night had given way to a tense, eerie quiet. The council was confident their problem was solved. The evidence and the witnesses were buried deep in the flooded mine. But they hadn't counted on Josephine. She had hidden in the church's bell tower, watching as Eleonora was captured. Using the chaos as cover, she'd stalked the two deputies left to guard the jail, taking them down with a heavy iron skillet from the church kitchen. She appeared at the cell doors like an avenging angel, Mabel's keys in hand. "Let's go," she said, unlocking their cells. "We have an escape to finish." They armed themselves, stole horses from the livery, and rode north, Jackson guiding them through secret paths only he knew. He led them to a hidden Apache encampment and to a tearful, impossible reunion. Sarah, Mary, and Rebecca were there, safe. The ledgers were safe. Everything was safe. The Apache chief, a man who respected Jackson, offered them an escort. They could travel through protected lands, bypassing the council's patrols, all the way to Fort Durango and the territorial governor. As they prepared to ride out, Eleonora stood beside Jackson, looking back at the canyons that had almost been their tomb. "It's over," she said. "It's just beginning," he replied, a grim determination in his eyes. "Now comes the justice." They had come to the West as 5 separate, desperate women, contracted to strangers in a town called Prosperity. They would leave as a family, forged in chaos, bound by courage. They hadn't found the security they were promised in a marriage contract. They had found something far better, strength in themselves and in each other. They rode out, the evidence that would destroy a town of lies tucked safely in their saddlebags, leaving the ghosts of Serpent Canyon behind them for good. This story shows that courage can be found in the most unexpected places. If you were inspired by the story of these 5 women, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming up. And check out the 2 videos on your screen right now for more tales of survival and justice against all odds. We'll see you there.